Welcome everyone to our panel discussion on Michael Brecker's practice notebooks. We have a lot of Brexperts here. Yes, I've made up that term. I think it's very fitting. So I'm going to go around and introduce everyone who's here. So we have Dr. David Demsey, who is a professor of jazz studies at William Paterson University, and oversees an archive of various jazz musicians, including the Michael Brecker Collection, which has the Michael Brecker's original practice notebooks.
Correct.
So it'd be great to have his contributions. We have two people from the publishing company that have just recently published the practice notebook. So we have Chuck Sher here, and he has, over the years, he's been responsible for publishing many fantastic jazz publications, famously the Mark Levine Jazz Piano Book and Theory Book, among many other great publications that have been endorsed by lots of great jazz musicians. And he was involved intimately with this recent publication of the practice notebooks of Michael Brecker. All right, which is fantastic. We also have Larry Dunlap here, who helped transcribe and put the chicken scratch of Michael Brecker into a nice and neat, readable, digestible print and digital version. So it's great to have him here too. All right, we also have Adam Niewood here. Adam is a great saxophonist and musician and drummer, and he worked on Michael Brecker's Mouthpieces right before Brecker recorded his last album, Pilgrimage. And they worked on a bunch of mouthpieces, including, I think, the Guardala that he ended up playing on the record, and got to know Michael Brecker in a very technical way that I don't think a lot of people really know him. All right, we also have Dr. Luis Palacios here. He is the director of applied instrumental performance and jazz studies at Northwest Nazarene University. He completed his dissertation on Michael Brecker's playing, and using Michael Brecker's playing as a form of analyzing Michael Brecker's playing to teach music and help students learn. So it'll be great to have his insights into how the practice notebooks can become skills. All righty, that'll be wonderful. And finally, we also have Rick Margitza here, who is famously one of a student and disciple of some of Brecker's playing. Though obviously he has his own thing as well. In fact, his name even shows up in the practice notebooks at least one time that I saw. So there's some little back and forth there, which is really fun to see. And we're actually going to start with a little personal anecdote from Rick about how he met him. So I'll let you take it away, Rick.
Yeah, hello everybody. So I just wanted to tell this quick story because the first time I met Michael, it was my freshman year of college. I grew up in Detroit, so we went to the Montreux Festival in Switzerland with the Wayne State University Big Band. And I had seen that the Brecker brothers were going to be playing while we were there. So I'd never met Michael. And throughout high school, I transcribed a bunch of his solos. So I was walking around for a couple days with my backpack and all of the solos with me, hoping to run into him. And one afternoon we were walking down the main thoroughfare, and I was with my friend Simon Austin, who's also a big Michael freak. And I said, "Simon, there he is." And I saw him walking down the street, and it seemed like there was a halo around him, and I heard music from the heavens coming down. So I got up the courage and I walked up to him and I just said, "Mr. Brecker," I looked up to him and I said, I took them out, obviously. I said, "I have these." And he looked at them, and it just is a testament to his sense of humor. He looked at them and said, "Wow, you're really into this shit, aren't you?" And then a testament to how nice of a person he was is before I even had a chance to ask him if he had any time, he said, "Why don't you come up to my hotel room tomorrow for a lesson?" And, I know from the experience of being out on the road, when you have an afternoon off, especially if it's the day of the concert. That time is kind of sacred, and it's difficult to kind of give up that personal time. But it was just so generous. He said, "Come up to my room," and there was never any talk about I charge this much or this. There's none of that. Just come up and let's hang out. And that's how I first got to meet him. And ever since that day, he was really supportive and really helpful. And we formed a friendship. I didn't spend a lot of time with him, but every time with him was super meaningful, and I learned a lot from him. And just to have his support and to be around him is something that I treasure.
Thank you for sharing that, Rick. It's fantastic. Cool. I mean, I had a little personal experience with him too. I'm just very little compared to a lot of you guys. I just went and saw him at a concert, and I stood in line to get his autograph, when I was in high school. And he was like trying to make a conversation with me about saxophone playing, but I was just like, just sign my little read box, guys. Anyways. All righty. So let's dive into these practice notebooks, guys. Can we for people who don't maybe haven't even looked into the notebooks yet, maybe haven't bought them yet or anything, could we get an overview of what they are exactly? And maybe I felt like Dr. Demsey might be great at that.
Sure. First of all, a couple of quick things. Rick, I've been digging your playing since early 80s, your first album. So really great to be with you.
Well, thank you. It means a lot. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
And, backing up what he said, that experience, if people are probably most of the people watching this did not know Mike. And I think we just need to make the quick point. Several of us can testify to this, that as much of a musical and saxophone giant as he was, that was eclipsed only by him as a person. He was just a spectacular person. And he was one of those people that had the gift of making you feel like you were the most important person in his life at that point when he was with
Absolutely.
you.
Yeah.
Really was 100% with you, and with somebody that was as busy as he was, as pulled in as many directions as he was, he had this amazing focus, and I knew him, as you said at the beginning, for 30 years, introduced by Joe, and he was moving fast. It wasn't like I was seeing him every week, but whenever I was with him, it was the same thing. It was kind of like, first question, how's your wife? How's Karen? How's your daughter? Our daughters are basically the same age. And in his sort of second life, going into the 80s and the 90s, that was what he was all about, being a dad, and then like, oh yeah, the saxophone. So anyway, to make that point, that he was just a superlative person who loved people and being with people. Okay, so the story of the notebooks, I first should say that having known Mike, a lot of times when I'm with this material, it kind of hits me. How could this have happened? How could this material be here on this campus in Wayne, New Jersey? Mike should be working on this at home. Wow, how did this happen? It's it's a major tragedy that we're all sitting here like this talking about. And then Mike's not down in the bottom box telling us what he did. So that said, this archive, Mike's archive, happened actually. We also have Clark Terry's archive. And curiously, this happened through Randy Brecker and Randy's connection with Clark. Randy was here to play with our students, as he so often does at many schools. And he said, I want to see Clark's archive, please. I'd like to see it. And he said, a lot of people don't realize that I owe my whole career to Clark, because Clark got me into, Duke Pearson's band. He got me into his own band. And most importantly, he got me into the studios. And of course, that would have been in the later, maybe 66, when everybody was still wearing jacket and tie, making records with Ella Fitzgerald and doing 3 or 4 sessions a day. 10 years after that, the whole scene had changed, and it was an R&B disco thing. And Mike and Randy owned that scene. You know, you didn't have a decent album in the late 70s if the Brecker brothers weren't on it. So Randy came and he said, this would have been 2 or 3 years after Mike had passed. And Randy saw the mission of the place, which is to, you know, store the stuff at the same high levels as it would be stored at the Library of Congress, but to have another copy of that music on the music stands for the students, you know. And that was kind of Clark's whole philosophy. He said, we're not talking about Clark's words. We're not talking about me being old. He said, Demsey, we're not talking about you being old someday soon. We're talking about 80 years from now. Like, what's the legacy we want to preserve? So we met with Susan, who was kind of confused and upset, obviously just in mourning, but at the same time confused about what to do. And we told her about the mission of the place. And we're an hour from Hastings, so the kids, Mike's children, could get here and see it. Susan can see the stuff, and it's not like it's going to, you know, someplace. It's nearby. And so there were a series of visits with Susan and getting more materials. It's always thinking, you know, music, sheet music, recordings, that's the heart of it, you know. And one day I was kind of out the door already, and we were talking, we have all the sheet music from all his albums, the original sheets that were on the stand, you know, handwritten stuff from whoever was on the album, guitar part, Pat Metheny would all marked it up, and Mike marked it up. So it's fascinating to see how the stuff grew. We have about 800 or 900 gig cassettes, DATs. It's
Wow.
You'll see it's all on the website. If you just go to michaelbreckerarchive.org, every item we have here is cataloged. So I was out the door and Susan goes, oh, one more thing. Do you want these? And I look back and she's got these notebooks. And I said, what is that? And she goes, it's just notebooks. It's not tunes. It's just little bits of stuff. And I said, I took the first one and I looked and I said, oh my God, you know, it's the Holy Grail. And she said, what? And I said, you know, Mike talked about these to me. He talked about it to a lot of fellow musicians. He talked about it in clinics. He would always advise to the students. He called them practice journals. He'd say, get a journal, write it down, be organized about it. And here was this stack of notebooks. And this is another subject maybe we can talk about later, but there are several of them, as you could see from Chuck's original note with the letters. There are several of them that we did not include because they're really not, they don't pertain to this. And we'll get into why we made that decision and stuff later. But the first thing I did was to scan the books. We couldn't put them up online. Obviously, it's private stuff. It's family stuff. It's his own stuff. But I wanted to make sure we had a digital copy of it. And anybody that came into the archive, you know, we have some of Mike's mouthpieces and we have all the stuff I've described to you, all this amazing stuff. But what seems to be attracting everybody is, I want to see the notebooks. So I then went to Susan and said, you know, you really should consider publishing these, of everything, publish these. And she said, okay, if you think they're important. And I went, yeah, they're not important. They're earth-shaking because there's so, as you were saying at the beginning, there's just so few jazz musicians anyway that did this, that thought like this. So we went to several publishers. I was kind of reaching out and they would say, wow, that sounds exciting. And I would send them 5 or 6 pages and they'd say, oh yeah, we can do that. How big is it? And I said, it's 800 pages. Crickets. That'd be the. And then what was this, a year and a half ago, Chuck?
Something like that. Yeah.
Chuck got in touch and said, we'd be interested. And I immediately pivoted to Susan and I said, this is your guy. Because in terms of his musicianship, his passion, and tenacity, I said, you know, this is the guy that did the new Real Book series. We can't even imagine never mind the copy work and trying to get all that stuff right, just the copyright stuff. This guy is an animal. This is the person that you want to do this. And she said, okay, and thus started it. And I already had the scanned copies. So Chuck, I just sent them to Chuck, and then he and Larry, sorry, I didn't meet you, Larry, when I was out on the West Coast recently, but Larry did all the copy work and we'd be back and forth. I wasn't involved. These two gentlemen did all of it, but then they were coming like, should we include this? What is this? How does that work? And then right at the end, there was some intrigue with the Mike's harmonic fingerings, not multiphonic fingerings, because he had taken them from a book, fellow saxophonists probably know the Ken Dorn book. And it has Ken made up another, like a horizontal fingering chart. But I didn't have the book. I knew about it and I had it and I couldn't find it. So we had to go back around and get the code and crack the code and transfer them into traditional saxophone fingerings, but all the credit goes to them. I was just kind of the conduit, keeping Susan raised and helping out whenever I could. So that's how it happened. And the most hilarious part is Susan saying, "Do you want these? Are they should I put these out?" And I just went, "Oh
Yeah.
Amazing amazing moments in archiving,
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that backstory. Maybe Chuck, you could give us an overview of what we got in the published version.
Sure. In case people haven't seen it, let me give you the cover here. You can buy this at shermusic.com, SHER. We have both a printed and a digital version. And when I got access to this material, like Dave, I was just blown away. There's so much in here. It would take a couple lifetimes for a normal human being to do what Michael did in one lifetime. But what I did first is I took all the scans that David sent me and I went through and picked out the things that I think would be useful to this ordinary musician. Some of it we couldn't use, like Dave said, because it was, people's phone numbers and social security numbers if he had to send them a 1099 or whatever. So, and there were a lot of transcribed solos that, again, we didn't have the copyright permission to use. So there was stuff that's left out. But Dave did a great thing, which is in the appendix. He cataloged all the solos that were in Mike's notebooks that he had transcribed. Very important just to see what he did. And if you want to see the transcriptions, you can go to William Paterson University, right? So I went through them all and I picked out what I thought would be useful. And then I sent them to Larry, and I have the utmost respect for Larry Dunlap. I've worked with him for 30 years and he's just an absolutely brilliant musician for one. And he's got such an ability to put things together and organize stuff. So he was the obvious person to do this. And so he took the original notebooks and, took the ones that I had picked out and for one, engraved them as beautifully as they are. And then he, which he can tell you how that worked, but there were a lot of places where things were ambiguous. As Dr. Palacios pointed out, things were ambiguous because Mike didn't do this for publication. It was just to remind him to go back and look at that lick again at some point. So it was a little difficult to make sure that everything made musical sense. And I think Larry did a great job. We had another wonderful musician proofread the whole book too. So between everything and everything, it's as whistle clean as it could be, as far as I can tell. So any other thoughts on that, Larry?
I would say, yeah, I had to make quite a few judgment calls because of the ambiguity of, is this note on a line or in a space? There were a lot of things like that. So I used my musical knowledge to, determine what I thought was meant. And sometimes there would be, figures that would be repeated. Obviously, Michael was, a big thing for him was play this in every key. He says that a lot after an example, after many of the examples. So sometimes I would see something that was written in a couple of different keys, and I would say, oh, yeah, but in this one, the note, might be in the space, but no, if it's going to match the sequence over here, then it's going to be on the line. Maybe an accidental was left out, things like that. I had to take into account and make my own judgment calls, and hopefully I didn't make too many errors in that. But I really enjoyed working on them. I mean, I'm mainly a piano player. I'm not a saxophone player at all, but it was, of course, this material is applicable to any jazz musician. They can get ideas. And there were things that I thought, can this be right? That maybe there would be a chord name, and there would be notes that he had written out, and I would say, is this really within this chord? And what I figured was, his thinking was so far above mine. He had a concept of, yeah, this works with this chord, but to me it seemed strange sometimes, but I tried to be as faithful to the notebooks as I could.
He could make it work, right?
Yeah. I mean, he would play out sometimes, but he definitely had a concept of what he was doing.
Awesome.
Organized chaos, basically.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that about the process and what we have in the notebooks. I think they span through almost his entire career, which is very cool.
Well, one thing I would say is the early notebooks are things from when he was still in school. And, there's a lot of things like, he's learning what a certain scale is or what a certain harmony is. And Chuck was, rightfully saying, well, maybe we don't need to include these. And I said, well, I think it's really nice to see the progression of how he was thinking, where it was coming from and these basic stages, and then how it developed and as the years went on. So I wanted to include those early things too. I pushed for that.
Thanks.
Dates are really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, the three early entities in Mike's kind of training are the Ramblerney Arts Camp, which is, I think that at that time it was in New Hope, Pennsylvania. It was run by Phil Woods. And actually there were a lot of Richie Cole was there, and there were a lot of well-known people at the camp at the same time. So there was that, and then he spent, I think, one summer at Berkeley, at the Berkeley summer camp. And then he was at Indiana University for a year and a half as an art major, by the way. He spent most of his time practicing, according to Randy. But yeah, so the early notebooks are from there. And there's a lot more from Indiana. For example, there's one notebook that is the Eugene Rousseau saxophone class handouts. It's all like classical saxophone repertoire. It's I'm only some of you will understand the term mimeograph. So it's a mimeograph sheet of all of the saxophone repertoire and practice guides and stuff. And then there's other things that are like he's writing Bach 4-part Bach chorales.
His homework.
Yeah. With the teacher's mark, it'd get a B+ with corrections, and that's on the left-hand page. On the right-hand page, he's transcribing something from A Love Supreme. So, so it's
shows
like
promise.
The worlds are colliding already,
Great.
and he's 19.
Larry, that was a great idea, including those early notebooks, though, because as I've gone through it, it's really neat to see that progression. You even see how he's experimenting with those 4-note cells and things like that, and we can get into that. and how
Mhm.
later that shows up and is playing all over the place. But he just begins to see different harmonic options for it. It's so neat. So thanks for doing that, Larry.
I had one quick question about the dates, because every once in a while, like you'll be into book 3 or book 4, and a date will show up that's from an earlier time period. Were those dates chronological, but he would maybe post date something that he found a while ago, or I was curious about that.
We just took what was there. So if it wasn't chronological, it's how the books were laid out, and maybe he went back in, he had an extra page and filled in something later. I don't really know, but
Yeah, a lot of these pages, Rick, sometimes there'll be, it's all different pencils. It's
Mhm.
different. And I think he would just go in and he probably had the notebooks and he would just grab one. And so
Right.
sometimes you get something in the middle of a notebook that's 6 or 7 years earlier than the previous page. But Chuck stayed with the same notebooks because otherwise it would have gotten really,
Yeah, I understand.
you know.
Dave,
Potentially he like
were they binded notebooks, or are they in 3-ring binders?
Yeah.
Or
Well, no, all of them were spiral bound, you know, the old wire bound notebooks, and some of them are old enough so they were getting rusty. Just to let you know how they're being stored. So I went to Susan and I said, Mrs. Brecker, permission requested to get the wire cutters out. We need to get rid of these wire bindings because they're rusting out and they're getting into the paper. So these books, these notebooks, like this was formerly a wire bound notebook. And now it's in, this is an acid free folder. It's in an acid free box. And then each of the pages are interleaved with a piece of acid free paper, just plain white acid free paper.
so they don't rub together.
Yeah, because any,
Yeah.
you know, any ink or lead, pencil, graphite, it's acidic. And
Mhm.
over the years, it's going to eat its neighbor. That's why you see an old piece of manuscript and it's all yellowed and stuff. So the idea is, I mean, these are out, it's a special occasion today. So these are out in the open, but for most of the time, they're just stored. That's another reason why I scanned them. So the students can go to these computers behind me and just look through things and take screenshots if they want to, et cetera, but they're not in there doing this
Right.
every, that's not a good way to, again, Clark Terry, we need these books to look just like they do now in 80 years. You know,
You make
so that's
people
how
wear
this
gloves.
is.
Do people have to wear gloves when they handle the
Well,
stuff?
I'm the only peoples, you know, like we have
Okay.
students just come in and go, oh, let me see, you know, nobody's
Yeah.
looking through them.
Okay.
Oops, you know.
No, I was just
The
curious.
folder, but again, I'm not laying the people out. Yeah, most of the time, there's no need for that white glove stuff. Sometimes if we're getting into something, I'll tell the students, you know, go wash your hands, use the hand sanitizer, use alcohol on them and really do that. But yeah, we're
Yeah.
trying to do everything we can to really, it's about preservation, you know. I didn't really have, I'm a saxophone player. I'm a teacher. I'm not an archivist. So when this started to happen to us, first with Thad Jones, who was the original director of this program, and Clark Terry, that's when I kind of put myself through school. I went to the Library of Congress for a week, trailed them around. I went to our neighbors down the road, Rutgers Newark Jazz Institute. And another place I went was to Cooperstown.
Mhm.
Friend of mine was the head research librarian at the Baseball Hall of Fame. And, you know, they
Interesting.
have in a way the biggest problem of all, because they're trying to store cloth, leather, wood, all the stuff that's, you know, they said, but, you know, our biggest problem, we got Cy Young's baseball uniform. And they said, we spent the first 30 years trying to get the tobacco stains off of the jersey. And now we spent the last 30 years trying to preserve the tobacco stains.
That's amazing. Wow.
No, so I kind of studied with all those people and
Mhm.
saw how they were doing it and the problems they were up against, and, you know, and just tried to learn from that and take the best of it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's transition, guys. and let's talk a little bit about some of the things in the notebooks and how, you guys are already thinking about using them musically, if you wouldn't mind. I'd love to go around and just talk about, have people talk about something they found in a notebook that was like, wow, this is great. I'm gonna try and use this. And I'll just leave it at that. And yeah, go ahead.
So I think it might be helpful if I start by describing this practice method that Michael told me that he had learned with and from a great saxophone player who was at school with him at Indiana, whose name is Gary Campbell. And I was lucky enough to study with Gary when I was at school at the University of Miami. So I kind of learned from Gary the same thing that Michael learned from Gary, and maybe some stuff that they had developed together. And a lot of it is kind of based on the Nicholas Slominski book, which is the book that supposedly Coltrane practiced out of. And it's a piano book, so not all of it can be applied to the saxophone. But the beginning of it, it's based on the division of the octave. So that's the part that relates to the saxophone, because at first it's the division of one octave, and after that it's the division of two, then three. So after a certain point, it's too wide for the saxophone. But by studying that book, there were basically 5 intervallic families by dividing up the octave into equal parts. So the first one is half steps, whole steps, minor thirds, major thirds, fourths, tritones. And after that, it doesn't really divide up the octave evenly, but you can say a fifth. But then anything after a fifth belongs to one of those first 6 groups. So half step, whole steps, minor thirds, major thirds, fourths, tritones, and fifths. So whatever they practiced in those intervallic combinations. And there's also this other part of it that has to do with directions. And there were 4 directions going up and 4 directions coming down. And I don't want to take too much of our time trying to explain all of this, because it's easier if we see it on paper. But the idea is to take something as simple as a triad and something as complex as a 6-7 note chord or a melodic shape, and practice it going up or going down in half steps, then whole steps, then minor thirds, major thirds, fourths, tritones, and fifths. So, by playing just a major triad going up in half steps, ascending sounds pretty basic, but when you're taking a major triad and you're going up the first one, down the second one, and you're thinking up in major thirds, it gets a lot more complex. And you start developing sounds and hearing things that you don't maybe necessarily hear when you just hear a major triad. So that's what Michael talks about, is in some of these notebooks, he would just write a 4-note motive, and he wouldn't write all of those permutations out, but that would represent maybe a half hour's worth of work in terms of taking that thing. Gary would just call it taking it through the routine. So you could take a triad or a 4-note thing or a 5-note chord and go up and down with it in all those intervallic combinations. And in the process of that, you find one that resonates with you. So I found that going through these notebooks, maybe some of them he wrote out in the intervallic relationship that he really liked after going through the whole process. And then the idea of keeping these notebooks is, for me, it's basically the idea of developing a vocabulary. It's like we're all learning a language. So that's why we transcribe, is to have something to base our language on. So you learn bird solos, but you don't want to play just bird solos. You want to have all that stuff in your ear, but then you want to try to come up with something that's personal as a result of all that study. So these notebooks, like Michael called them, is like a musical journal, or I call them my musical diary. So every time I practice, I have one next to me, and whatever I find, I put that in there. And then as a result of going through this routine, I just make a note, say, this sounds good in major thirds, or this one sounds good going down in whole steps. And slowly but surely you start developing a language that becomes how you play. That's an aspect of how you play. So I remember talking to Michael about how to practice like this, and he says, and you put the dates down, right? And I said, of course you do. So we both kind of had a laugh about that one. So we're doing the same thing without really realizing it, but the thing of practicing with these intervallic combinations is a way to develop these sound and your language.
Rick, do you remember giving me the first saxophone lesson when I was like 17, 18 in your apartment in Washington Heights? And I had contacted you out of the blue and I said, I love your playing. I want to have a lesson. And you said, that's really funny. I have an anecdote to share with you. Sure, come on over.
Of course.
Then, I mean, it's like crazy that you showed me the system, which is basically breaking it into directions, either ascending, descending, all the intervallic systems, and then you're working any idea in every possible, like chutes and ladders, every possible direction, so that you can just hear something and apply it immediately, and it just gels because you've already worked the cobwebs and all the dust off of like the mechanism of the sax, right? So I'm remembering like all these dots are connecting. I'm remembering the first time I heard Michael Brecker play was at William Paterson, the Jazz Room, thanks to David Demsey.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found out about your playing from a fellow student at William Paterson, and then started checking out all your records, got the lesson with you. And then years later, right before the shutdown in 2020, we were in New Orleans. You let me borrow your sax to play with Liebman, Perla, and Nussbaum.
Mm-hmm.
And then right afterwards, who was in the audience? Gary Campbell. Then I say,
Yeah.
hey, Rick Margitza showed me your system. And that became what I taught at Montclair State and at every place I've taught. Like everybody who's had a lesson with me, that's what they get. They get the Joe Allard overtones from Demsey, and then the system of how to practice things in every direction. So this is kind of like the 6 degrees of Michael Brecker.
Oh, absolutely. And
Everything's all intertwined, you know?
If I could just mention this quickly, that Adam's father, Jerry, is one of my, and continues to be one of my major influences. I list him with Michael, Coltrane, Charlie Parker, and Jerry. Those are my first 4 guys. The sense of swing and sound and melody and intonation and everything, it's so elegant and so beautiful that he's like in my musical DNA. So for Adam to be here, to be part of this, and it's a very small circle.
It's all connected and intertwined together. It's really, and every saxophone player, you know, you're bringing up Campbell.
Yeah,
everybody knows everybody. Everybody's interconnected. It's that's all I'm going to say.
That's
yeah.
probably
One last thing. I'll let everybody else chime in. This way of practicing allows you to get from anywhere to anywhere. So there are no wrong notes. So you really have to know your theory down cold, because you have to know what the inner workings of each key are, so you know what your targets are. So say, for example, if you're thinking about a D minor 7 chord, those top 3 notes, the F, A, C, right? 3rd, 5th, and 7th, that's an F triad. So if you don't even have to think about the key that you're in, if you're thinking about that F triad and hearing that as a target, if you practice the F triad in all those different combinations, you could get to it from anywhere. You can get to it from B flat triad, from A flat, because it's just a minor 3rd down. From an A triad, it's a major 3rd above. From a D flat triad, which is a major 3rd below. So all those wrong notes over D minor do not matter, because you're hearing that F as your target, and you know that F is the really strong sound and a melodic goal over D minor. So Larry, when you're saying you're looking through the notebooks and seeing some of the stuff that doesn't make sense over the chord, basically I tell my students there are no wrong notes, but you have to know what all the right notes are, and then you can get to anywhere from anywhere. I know that's a little abstract, but
Well, I think we see that in Brecker's playing a lot. He's developed those 4-note cells that can get him to where he wants to go all the time. And that's what I was talking about. It's really neat about seeing the early notebooks, because you start seeing that experimentation. Well, he'll be somewhere way off, but he'll add that last little 4-note cell to get him to where he wants to go for the resolution.
Mhm.
So a lot of that evolution of what's happening and that idea of looking at that. Which for me, if we're talking about what has stuck out to me the most, what's really interesting about that practice method, and I'm familiar with it just through third party and study and books, but what's really neat is looking at Brecker's approach to taking these fundamental things like triads and playing with how he approaches them both above and below. So when you start adding that above and below, and then you start thinking about how he likes to do these almost piano grit voicings for chords, where he adds a fourth in between, now you have almost endless possibilities on something as simple as 2 major triads back to back.
Yeah.
And so seeing that, I mean, we all work through that in school because that's how we learn to play through things beyond just playing licks. But it's humbling to see how his mind was so organized to really approach it and say in the book, come from half a step above, come from half a step below. And then he might put major triads in the diminished seventh outline, and then major triads in the augmented outline. And then you'll see major triads in whole steps and all these kind of different approaches. And then you see what you're saying, Rick, that at the end, he'll stick in a 4-note cell and great, we're on the third of the chord, we made it. So it's really neat to see that perspective. And I think for students, you know, you've all had students before. How many of you have heard somebody say, how do I play out? How do I play? And it doesn't really matter. The magic is getting back.
I
That's
actually remember asking Mike in my early years that exact question. And he looks at me and he goes, there is no out. He goes, I'm always thinking it might be by interval, it might be giant steps, it might be by half steps. And then he pauses and he goes, getting out's easy. It's getting back in that's the problem. He
That's
said
the
that's what
thing.
you're always working toward. So in a way, those 2 quotes kind of nail everything. Oh, and one other, just to comment on something Rick said, he put stars next to the stuff that he liked. And I'm Larry and Chuck, I'm so glad you've retained those stars. in
Yeah.
there. The book has stuff, and at first I thought, oh, this is some kind of code. And I realized, 1 star, that's like, yeah, this works. And then you start to get 2, 3, 4 stars. And that's when Mike's going, oh, wow, I really found something. So that is retained in this book, but when you see the stars and they're not handwritten and they're in ink, you get this star. It seems like it's some kind of an asterisk or a code. And I don't think it is, other than check this one out.
Yeah, I think it is too. Yeah, that struck me going through them like that. Yeah, these stars are important.
And he
What I
loved
like-
exclamation marks too.
Yeah.
He'd say some things, he'd say practice in all keys, and then other times he'd go in all keys, like about
And just to show how literal this is, hopefully everyone's seeing this.
Nice. Yeah, look at that.
Yeah. So the top example, this is from one of his early notebooks, book 2. Anyways, and here's G minor. He says he's play A flat major on G minor 7. Play a triad half step above minor 7. Yeah. And he just writes out a little example, and I'm sure he 12 keyed that or whatever it is, Anyways, I just wanted to bring that up real quick. I don't mean to interrupt the conversation entirely there.
No, it's adding to it.
Good.
Yeah, so
I like
go
the
ahead.
fact that in the books, you can clearly see that he was checking out everybody. Like there's Joey Calderazzo. He's quoting the people that he's checking out. So he's freely quoting the source of the information. There's no musical plagiarism, right? And that he's open. Like there's a part in the book where it's like Eric Alexander, and he has he's
Woody
checking
Shaw.
out Woody Shaw. Who else? I mean, is there Eddie Harris? He has various licks in there and stuff that he's
Hank
lifting.
Crawford, Freddie Hubbard,
More Joe
Like
Margitz
everybody.
than I expected.
So he was checking out everybody, which is the whole point. When people are like, well, I don't know what to play. Adam, what do I play? The students, they're coming to you kind of like deer in the headlights. And it's like, well, what records are you listening to? Like, who were you listening to? And are you trying to mimic and copy what you like? Like, first you have to decide what you like. But I like that throughout the book, you can see that he is open, not shut off or closed to anything. He's open to everybody, including younger saxophone players.
And what's neat about that too is you'll see an example, and 2 or 3 examples later, you'll see that concept pop up in his own way. We talk to our students, how do we do that? But he really takes the structure of what's happening from that quote or whatever lick he got and says, well, now this is my way to approach it from below or above or move around. So it's super neat. It's almost like seeing his actual progression. It's such a neat thing.
Reverse engineering his mental process. It's really, it's the best money I've spent. I bought the book for full price. I didn't ask for like, hey, send me a freebie. I'll check it out and write a review. I just ordered it. It showed up on the doorstep 2 days later, and it's the best money I spent this year.
Seconded.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things I think people will be hearing about this for the next 5-10 years. Some nugget that comes out of nowhere where none of us knew what it was. And some guy in the middle of anywhere will be, hey, that's from here. Because there's some quotes in there that I'm not sure who they are. Some of the names, I've never heard of them before. And I'm curious who they are in his lifetime that he ran into.
I know everybody except Boston guy.
Yeah.
You see that? The first of the guys, a Boston guy. And I was trying to figure out who that is.
Some guy in Boston. That's me. That's my lick.
It's not Bergonzi because he mentions Jerry.
Yeah.
There's Franco, who is Franco Ambrosetti, Ronnie Cuber. But anyway, yeah, that's just beside the point. But
I mean, since receiving it now, when I go up to practice, if I have like 15, 20 minutes in between something, I take just one idea, and it's really clear. He doesn't write it out in every key for you. He wants you to kind of like use your instrument and find your way through it. So rather than trying to like, oh, I'm going to read through like 10 pages of this, it's not that kind of book. Like you take like one little idea, 2 measures, 4 measure idea, and then that's it. And then you work that for 15, 20 minutes. That's your practice session. One line on the book.
We got at least one comment where somebody said, "Oh, I wish these were written out in every key." And I said, "No, that's the point.
That's the point.
Write it out in every key."
Right.
Yeah.
If you need to write it out, you're not ready for it yet.
Yeah.
If you practice this way, it definitely helps you think faster. I remember when in that first lesson I had with him, he talked about Joe Henderson and Joe's ability to think really quickly. Because this is interesting. One of my first questions was, when you play, are you thinking? And he said yes. But comically, years later, I'd heard another interview and I asked him that same question, are you thinking when you play? And he said no. So I think it's a little bit of both going on. But there's definitely a guiding intellect. It's not just playing and hoping things come from the sky. It's not that. It's an intellectual music that has to be learned that way and then filtered through just inspiration and instinct. But when you practice this way, it definitely gives you the ability to make decisions quicker, and maybe not decisions in terms of like, I'm going to play this lick and then this lick, but it's like global decisions about form and structure and switching maybe between, I'm going to think about just the one chord, or this is going to be giant steps. And now it feels like it needs to come inside. So it's like those kind of instinctual decisions are made more quickly. So you have to practice this way, going through the routine to give you the ability to make decisions quicker. So I remember Adam said, you take one little 4-note cell, and it maybe at first took me a half an hour to take it through that whole routine, or maybe even longer. But now I could do it in maybe 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how complicated it is. So that's why it's good not to have everything written out in every key. You need to do the work. It's like you need to go to the gym.
Yeah, his adaptitude with that was, we have a recording of a workshop. Adam, you must have been there, and maybe there are others too. But he said to the students, he was talking about this, practicing cells, and he said, "Okay, give me 4 pitches," and he just took different people set a pitch, so it was random stuff, and he kind of organized. He said, "Okay, I'll play it this way," and then he says, "Now, let's just do it in half steps to start." And he starts like slowly. And he did about 4 or 5 of them. And then it was like this digital thing where it just went
It's off to the
Mhm.
races.
up all the way up into the altissimo, and the whole room just cracked up. It was just to hear it that fast come out. And he didn't get it. He thought that everybody was laughing because he was being so repetitive. Yeah, I know. This is probably boring because I did all that. And he missed the point that he just had blown everybody's mind. So yeah, his adaptitude with it was astounding, just technically, how fast he could get to stuff.
And he was a master. So I always talk about the idea of the macro and micro phrasing, right? Structures. And he was a master of, like what Rick was talking about. He had a master plan. If you ever transcribe any of his like unaccompanied stuff, it's incredible. It's obviously he has a plan for what he's doing. And then he has all these micro phrases, and the way he gets through them are those 4-note cells and those permutations. I mean, he'll move through 30 different key signatures, 30 and all these tonalities in like 20 seconds. And as you analyze, he'll take 2 notes from a triad, 2 notes from another triad, linking a half step, and all of a sudden, all of this incredible stuff is happening at the micro level that speaks to that whole idea of what he's doing for an A section. And I've never, I think to this day, seen that kind of organization happening. You have to pre-plan that stuff. You have to sit for hours and hours and almost religiously practice that, because it's like a great orator. If you don't have the vocabulary, you don't have the smoothness, the language, you can't speak well. And he always felt like he was just speaking like himself. Beautiful what he can do.
I mean, his understanding of harmony and composition. If you study his music, it's an extension of the way he plays. And you're talking about how he plays. It's interesting how he would be the bass and then have his accompaniment and then put the melody on top, a cappella solo, and you would hear the complete structure of everything. He was the complete musician. He understood. It wasn't just like his function as a saxophonist. He understood the harmony, composition, arranging, the complete musician.
And it's incredible how you put that together. Again, with the unaccompanied stuff, you'll see him start a motive at the beginning of it, and that motive will be everywhere in every possible permutation until the final end where he'll play the same motive again. And you're thinking, it's been 11 minutes. How do you still remember that motive after everything you did? And I think it's because of this practice routine. He just had that mentality to do that. And it makes it very possible for us to basically think about that process where he's thinking about that big structure of what he's looking at.
One note that we should add, because in all these people that he quotes, Woody Shaw, Freddie Hubbard, past people, he very rarely mentions Train. And you say, oh, I thought he was heavily influenced by Train. But if you look at that appendix that Chuck mentioned, there's 2 books full of just transcribed solos from Mike. And Chuck and I, we both saw that it doesn't make any sense, because if you engrave this transcribed solo, now we have a transcribed solo on Giant Steps, and the fact that it was in Mike's handwriting, the point is that he did it, not to actually look at it. So if you look through that appendix, most of the solos that he transcribed, it's probably 80% of them are Train solos.
Mhm.
So Coltrane's just pervasive in there in terms of his transcribed solos, but then in terms of the ideas he's taking, that's sort of, these people are all the other people besides Train, because he already had these solos. He had bookfuls of them. And he also, by the way, there's 2 books of tunes, handwritten tunes from other people, Train tunes, everybody. Again,
Mhm.
this broad spectrum of standards, Gershwin tunes, Train tunes, Woody Shaw tunes, and it's all just handwritten lead sheets, And we saw that it's more important to list in the appendix what those tunes are, rather than to pay the copyright to,
Right.
it doesn't make any sense, because they're already in a lot of fake books, but the fact that Mike hand wrote them before those fake books existed.
Did
Well,
he
the
make?
thing about the
I'm sorry.
No, so it could be besides the quoting of certain people in the book, there are a lot of things that are specifically influenced by trained, but maybe not transcribed directly. There's a lot of giant steps material, countdown changes. So a lot of that, the whole major third, you know, when you get to that part, the half steps, whole steps, minor thirds, when you get to the major third, that represents the three tonic system, which is giant steps. Right. So that's all over the place. So that's kind of pervasive in all the modern guys. So they may not be specific train lines from a specific solo, but obviously coming from that.
Did he make any
universe.
notes on the transcriptions themselves? Like circled anything or highlighted anything?
There's very little, you mean in those transcription books?
Yeah.
There's very little notation in the books other than the solos. Like he would
Mhm.
not, there are very few examples of like, oh, check this lick out. It's just the solos there.
Interesting.
And a lot of the stuff, you know, especially in his early years, it was communal. So there'd be solos that are in his and heads that are obviously in his handwriting. Then the next couple of pages will be somebody else's handwriting.
Yeah.
You know, so we'd have to really do some detective work with those people to figure out who wrote this. And who knows, it could be another student at the Berkeley summer camp or something. Could be anybody. But they're slightly communal as well. And some of the pages in the sketchbooks are not Mike's writing. Not the stuff that we're talking about, but especially the early years.
Mhm.
You know.
Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. So I invited people who are watching to give us some questions. So I thought maybe we could field some questions. Benjamin asks, any mention of his work with the iwi in Brecker's notes? He wants the secrets to how to use an iwi. I think that's what's going on there.
Practice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
so
and kind of there's two levels to that, because first was the Steiner phone, quote unquote. In other words, the not pre-digital, if we can call it that now, that went into the Oberheim expander. I mean, that was another whole set of languages. And one of these books actually is the manual for that.
Wow.
So it's pages. I'll put my hands on it if you want, but each page is a Xeroxed sketch or a image of the patch thing. And then he has written in, like, this is where this all gets set. So there's that. But then when you get into the actual iwi and the digital stuff, that's another, he had to totally relearn it. So the one word answer in these books, no. But these licks ended up coming out of the iwi a lot. But yeah, I felt like to get into all that technical stuff was missing the point of this. I mean, if we could get permission, for example, from Niall Steiner, be very interesting to publish this.
And a Kai.
Mhm.
You know, that'll be another mind blower, smaller audience, but equally mind blowing.
You know, I tried to play an iwi, and I literally could not get a C major scale out. It was so difficult.
It's
so when
hard.
you hear this, it's really, so when you hear the stuff that he did on that, plus all the programming and how he made it so musical, that to me is as staggering as his saxophone playing, because it's such a difficult instrument, and it's extraordinary that he got that out of that.
He told me, I asked him, you know, what's the best way to learn it? And he says, try to teach yourself to play music that you already know really well on the sax or another instrument on the iwi, and then intuitively you're going to figure out you will figure out the fingerboard of the instrument, which, as you're saying, Rick, it's like saxophone, but then it has elements of flute, and then there's kind of an element of the clarinet too. So it's
so touch sensitive. I mean, it was just glitchy, plus learning the rollers for the octave. I mean,
it's the opposite, where with saxophone you're taught to keep the pearls always in contact with your finger, but on iwi, if your finger is touching the metal, it completes the cycle,
triggering something. Yeah.
And then so you have to, it's the opposite of having your fingers off of the buttons. But I made the biggest, I know that the question wasn't directed to me, but I did learn the instrument the fastest when I took out Bach cello suites and flute etudes that I was already really aware, very aware. Now my son is playing trumpet downstairs. Buddy, I'm on Zoom. Please don't do that until we're done, or go in the backyard.
Practice an iwi.
Yeah. He's practicing this trumpet. Oh, to know him is to love him. So yeah, you have to play music that you already know really well on the iwi, and then intuitively you're going to figure out the fingering system.
Hey guys, so we got thanks for sharing, guys. We have some mysteries that people want solved. Let's see if we can do this for them, or at least get our best guesses. So here on page 15, we've got 5 to 56/58 or something, and press hard. Any ideas?
All I can tell you is that's exactly the way he wrote it in the handwritten version, and I have no idea what it means.
Okay. I mean, I could imagine he's using some serious embouchure pressure for the altissimo notes. I mean, obviously you don't want to overdo the embouchure pressure, but you need increased embouchure pressure.
I think
jump
he's
off that high.
referring to fingers press hard. I think.
Cool.
And why?
All right.
You guys got any thoughts on that? I think
Maybe
press
because-
hard means
Yeah,
hands.
I think so too, because since it's such a high octave jump, if you don't, you might not, like press them at the same time. So maybe the idea is to make sure you come down as you need to.
He gets a very percussive.
Yeah.
I talked when we were working together. I said, you play the drums. I said, did you ever think about playing gigs on drums? He goes, I don't need to. I play the drums on the sax. He does. He plays the sax like a percussion instrument. So maybe push hard.
Sorry, Adam. I'm sorry. No. One of my favorite little spots, and it made it into this book, is a quote Mike wrote at the top of one page, and he goes, "Practice lines without tonguing. The time is in your hands."
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's great. I don't know, those of you that studied with him, I had one of the most humbling moments of my life when he said, okay, let's do an exercise. And Mike was what, 6'5". So he said, all right, you put your horn on and you just do this and blow into it. And he reached around and played. And it was like Mike's ridiculous stuff and my sound. And the blowing part was the other way around.
Yeah.
Took his horn, he's blowing, and it's my totally immortal stuff, but his sound. And
Wow.
I just wanted to crawl under a table. It was just like that said it right there. And he was doing he said, just blow a straight sound. Don't try to go with me. And he was doing all the double clutching, the harmonic stuff. It was like all the sophistication of those lines was coming out of my horn. It's all just, and the time, killing time,
Yeah, I definitely have my students practice. I always say no articulation to make sure that your fingers are even, because you could cheat a lot with this to make up for this not being clean.
Okay, awesome. Another question here. Page 60, page 33. We have this also add stands E triad over C7, C7 sharp 5. The question is simply, who is Stan?
Yeah,
the date range?
probably.
I'm
Stan
thinking
Getz. I would think Stan Getz.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe
And
something.
E major over C7 isn't exactly a Getz-like thing, but I think Stan played those shapes against it.
Well, so we're talking about how you could get to where you're going from anywhere. So if that C7 is going to F major, then that E triad represents an F diminished major chord, which could then resolve to F major. So the E, even though it's kind of, it has the B natural, so it's an avoid note over C7. If you're going to F major, then that's how it functions. So, and Stan used that sound a lot, of the diminished major resolving to major.
Wow.
And there's one other thing that I just kind of wanted to mention that I always kind of found interesting is he a lot refers to the Lydian augmented scale. which is really just the third mode of melodic minor. And when he used the Lydian augmented, he used it as melodic minor. So if you're over, say, C7, and you want to play C7 altered, it's really C sharp melodic minor over C. And what all the old bebop guys are doing is really, they're not thinking flat 9, sharp 11, flat 13. That's way too much thinking. You're just hearing C sharp minor over C, because that's the sound that will get you to to either F minor or F major. So that's one thing I never asked him about, is why think about it as Lydian augmented and not just C sharp minor. But so he refers in the book a lot to Lydian augmented, which is just the third mode of melodic minor.
He did there's some examples in the book though where over the 5 chord he's putting half a step above the minor 7. So it's in there somewhere.
That's altered. Yeah, that's altered. And it's a half step melodic minor. That's those are all completely legal.
He does that a lot in my favorite solos of his in Peep. He's doing that all over the place on the F sus chord. Just let's go. Anyways, cool.
You ever mention the term altered? I don't think he does. He always calls it Lydian like Lydaug.
Yeah,
here's
yeah,
a
right
great
there.
example right here.
Like it's highlighted.
Yeah. Hey, so follow up on the fingerings question. So we're talking about the fingerings. So he says practice double fingerings. Any idea what the heck that is?
Yeah, I think he's talking about alternate fingerings, because in the one lesson he told me he was working on playing either just at first just chromatic scales or major scales and having an alternate fingering for every note. So I can't play really loud. It's kind of late here and it's going to sound pretty bad, but the idea is to.
It's going to sound pretty great.
So you have a double fingering for each note. And then he did that that was a chromatic scale, obviously, but over major scales or over diminished, and I think he says half diminished scales or whatever. But I think that's what he meant when he was talking about double fingerings.
Cool. Thank you, Rick.
Rick, it was hard to hear what via Zoom, but were you like alternating?
Can you show the horn? Can you show just like your fingers on the
he
keyboard?
would play the note, then he would play the alternate fingering, then up a half step with the alternate fingering to the note. So it was like back and forth.
He would do both. Here I was playing the original, then the alternate, then the original, then the alternate. Should I try to do it again? So it's. That's easier than doing it the other way.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I really do it that way. I usually do it original, the alternate, original, alternate.
I remember Mike did that with the alternating thing, and I said, how the heck long did it take you to figure that out? And he said, about 2 weeks. And I said, and he goes, no, you don't understand. That's all I played for 2 weeks, like 10 hours. And I kind of went, got it.
His poor neighbors.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
When he says that refers to the other, like the one that every kid knows is you play A and then you put for those people listening, you play A and then you put your right hand down. And that you can do what Rick just showed is that you can do that for every note. You just have to have your tongue together.
Yeah, some of them are just overblowing like D's and things like that.
Okay, guys, so we've got another question here. So Dr. Palacios or anyone, how has learning about Michael's solos changed the way you teach saxophone?
Well, one of the interesting things for me, so my connection with Michael Brecker is he's the first saxophone I remember ever hearing, saxophonist. So imagine that I'm in like grade school, elementary school, I hear Michael Brecker and I have no idea what's going on, but it's super cool. And I think that's one of the neat things about Brecker. He can appeal to anyone. You could hear something crazy or hear something neat. And so over the years, that influenced everything I did. But after going through the doctoral research and all that, and just doing what everybody does, transcribing, I started realizing that his systematic way is super great if you extrapolate that and you basically get, here's everything you need to play it at this level and make exercises on every little thing. So I tell my students that whatever you want to do on saxophone or any instrument, there's an exercise for it. And so obviously there's a Gary Campbell method, all those different things, and then approaching it from saying, okay, well, Brecker likes to use these 4-note cells. Well, you don't need just these 4-note cells. You can have any, as long as you find chromatic ways to move from one way to another. And so the process for teaching it is looking at that and seeing, well, there's a lot of basic structure things that everybody has to know. And I really like that in the first notebook where he talks about, I think, melodic minor thirds or harmonic minor thirds. For some reason, that's a step that young students skip. They go immediately to learning licks and they don't sit down and learn the thirds, they don't learn fourths, they don't learn the different permutations of that, all those different things. So I like to focus on thinking, okay, well, Brecker sounds like this, but if you dissect Brecker, it's because all these basic, simple ideas are so ingrained in his playing and he's comfortable with them. So let's simplify what we're doing. Let's get out of playing train changes and let's come back and say, well, can you play your scales in thirds? Can you play diatonic sevenths on every type of scale? Those kind of things. And then finding ways to do that and build your vocabulary that way with actual vocabulary like typical licks and stuff we'll transcribe, and using those smaller cells, scales, those patterns as connecting material in the language. And before you know it, you have that conversation that we talked about, where you have language, connecting material, more language, connecting material, and then it's just learning style through transcription. So that's kind of how it breaks down that idea. And then I think the other thing for saxophonists in particular is the extended techniques. You have to do that, I think, as a modern saxophone player. And too many jazz saxophonists shy away from classical saxophone. That will make or break you, I think. And obviously, it's Joe Allard method, all those different things. But the idea of approaching that literature, some people don't like it, that's fine, but it's a great tool. You know, play through those Furling etudes, play through all the Marcel Mule stuff. It's incredible. Learn that rep, because for me personally, that's what taught me how to play saxophone. That taught me tongue position, that taught me control, intonation. A lot of times we can skip over those basic fundamental things, and we realize Brecker didn't do that. Brecker spent some time and devoted himself to those fundamental things so he can do that approach. So I think it's taking that idea of this big, incredible, almost unobtainable image and finding ways to obtain it through smaller chunks of what's going on and how to work that out.
Well, David, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Allard exercises, because I was thinking about the other day. It's like saxophone is taught in a way where we're always playing just the fingered note, you know, the note that it's in the fingering system, and it's kind of along the lines of like playing trumpet in the first partial only. And then when I figured out with you that there was all these partials above the written note, and that is the missing link between Brecker having 2, 3, and multiple ways of fingering the same pitch. Do you want to talk about Allard a little bit? Because Brecker studied with Allard, right? Okay.
Yeah. Is that okay? You mind?
Yeah, please.
Does anybody else mind?
Well, the idea with Joe was that you would have, when you, let's say you play a top line F, that your tongue position, throat, everything is aligned as though you were singing that F. I mean, to put it my way, it's like you're a giant F. Everything, you know, and at this point, it was long enough ago that I studied with Joe that I can't remember what he said and what has kind of occurred to me since, because a lot of Joe's teachings, you know, I would do it and I just made up my mind, however weird it was, I would just do it. And then, you know, 2 years later, I'd go, oh, like that's why he wanted us to do that. So some of it, I guess, is me, but it's all Joe's teaching. And, you know, it was all about getting pre-hearing, getting your tongue and everything aligned so that those overtones So when you play that F, all the overtones of the F line up. And so some people think that playing the overtones is all about altissimo, upper notes. And to me, it isn't. It's all about the lower notes. It's getting more resonance in your sound. Like you take Joe's students, people that study with him, Mike, Bob Bird, Eddie Daniels, Pepper Adams, who am I forgetting? There's some major jazz, Liebman, I'm forgetting.
Liebman, Eric Dolphy.
Yes, bass clarinet. Yeah,
Grossman.
Steve,
Didn't Grossman study with him too?
Yeah.
Yep, Pete Yellen. And if you actually listen to their sounds, there's a resonance there that is in common. Each of them sound very different, which to me is a great element of Joe's teaching, that the students didn't come out sounding like Joe wanted them to. They came out sounding like them. I remember Joe saying, he'd have a big mirror in the studio and he'd say, here's you and here's me. We obviously look different. We're just as different inside. The roof of your mouth, your tongue, your dental structure, everything. So he said, you need to figure out what you sound like. And the only way to do it is to get your tongue happening and get all that aligned up, because it's going to give you your unique sound. And Mike used to, even though he had high baffle mouthpieces, Adam can talk more about this, but he used to struggle with it. And he used to say, he used to call it a false brightness, that high baffle mouthpieces happen because people don't have their tongue together. That baffle needs to come back here, soft tissue, not in the mouthpiece. It's going to get you a different result because you can move it around and adjust and everything else. So, Dave Lehman's website actually has the Joe Allard overtone chart that Joe hand wrote for us, but I can send it to you and I can send it to anybody who's listening. Joe was handwriting it, which was frankly costing all of us a lot of money listening to Toscanini stories while Joe wrote out 4 pages. So in my last 3 months of studying, I did it on note processing and I handed him a stack of them and said, here, just hand this to people. And Joe said, oh, thank God. This is saving, hours. So he used it himself in his lessons. It's verbatim what he gave us, and I can send it to you. That's what Adam has. And yeah. So to me, that pre-hearing thing, and it wasn't just the overtones that involved sound. It involved also pre-hearing. Joe would not let us play a tune until first sing the bass line, sing the melody, then the bass line, then arpeggiate all the changes vocally. He made us totally hear things before we would pick up a saxophone. So it was all about, and that involved classical music too. I remember I had to sight sing the Glazunov and Ibert before he'd let me play them.
Wow.
Slow, not at speed. I'm no singer. That Adam can testify to that. But as a pitch row.
Yeah.
But that's neat. I think back to that previous question about for teachers or how to teach this kind of thing. What a great example. Brecker working on those overtones, and then all of a sudden it's in this Delta City Blues. Seeing that progression from the exercise to using it musically, it's incredible in his music.
What page, Ben? What page is that? I remember thinking the same thing. What page is that in the book where it's like the beginning of Delta City Blues?
Yeah, I just saw that earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you find it, I can share it. I don't.
The light bulb went off when I was reading the same page in the book. I was like, oh man, that's that song.
It's
The funny
towards the
thing
end.
is that in all the sheet music we have, there's no complete written out part of the saxophone part for Delta City. All he's got is the rhythm section.
I was curious about that.
Yeah, he never, if he did write it out, it didn't make it here. So
I mean, maybe this
so
is
much
like,
fun.
if anybody that met Mike, he was so humble, and you'd be like, oh, that was the most amazing thing I ever heard. And then he would say, oh, I was having trouble finding a reed. And you'd be like, what? So it brings me to like Malcolm Gladwell and the 10,000 Hours to Mastery. And if you get this book, if you check out the way that he practiced everything, it proves that he wasn't just like, and I'm going to curb myself and bite my tongue. I'm not going to say like a name of a child prodigy, because that's counterintuitive. But he wasn't just like this person who came out of nowhere having the saxophone completely mastered from the time he was 12. He worked really hard and systematically figured the instrument out, like mechanically how it works. And if you do it the same way that he did it and have that work ethic, that it's a lack of laziness that anybody can be as good if you put in the 10,000, or in this case, like 10 million hours of work.
Yep.
Well, you can get to a certain point technically to master it, but there's also obviously just something about his genius of hearing beautiful things.
Yeah.
So you can practice all you want, but if you don't have that gift, that's also part of it. But definitely
His taste was a major. He had great taste.
Well, and he was so varied, right? He listened to everything. That's another thing about him. Sometimes we pigeonhole ourselves into one type of music or one type of playing, and really he was all over the place. I think there's a Bulgarian thing he talks about in one of the licks on one of the pages. It's so neat that he expanded his mind so much that it just makes sense. He can be in any setting.
He was getting into that music towards the end of his life. He was really into the Bulgarian, so that was going to be his next project.
Yes.
As far as
And apparently, all that music still exists.
So Ben, you have it pulled up right there. Boom, boom.
Yeah. So it's got overtones here first, and then doesn't have this E flat with the B notated below it. I mean, well, he didn't have it in parentheses like he has the other two overtones, and then down here he's got the funk thing just written as and it looks like maybe those are his little overtone markings there, right? Those little yeah. Cool. Hey, so I was looking at this, guys. Any idea what tune this is? New tune, fast? Is that recognizable to anybody? Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay, fair enough.
If you scroll down, if you look at example number 45.
Here we are.
That's the second part of Delta City Blues, where he goes through the cycle.
With two exclamation marks too. He's like, I like this. Very cool. All right. Well, we brought up the equipment thing momentarily with the baffle, and maybe Adam wants to, and anybody who wants to chime in. I mean, this isn't directly related to the notebooks, but obviously there's been a lot of discussion and rumors over the years about what did Brecker play on, what did he like, what, I think that'd be while we have all you guys here, why don't we just tell people, what did Brecker play on? What's the secret? What serial number horn? And am I buying on eBay tomorrow?
Of course, if you get that horn, you'll sound exactly like mine.
Exactly. I know. So just help me out.
Anybody else want to go first?
Well, the one thing that I found fascinating is, Adam, on Facebook, you've shared the note that he sent to you after you worked with him. And one of the sentences was, and we still have so much work to do, or there's lots of work to be done.
That was tragic.
But it blew me away that he had this amazing sound, and he still, like, what else did he want to do with the mouthpiece to make it better? What was he specific, or just in general, there's always...
He was just really creative. I mean, all right. So like he had like at least like 17 Gardalas, right? So it's like, it wasn't just like one. And then I have a vivid memory of him playing. I had a hard rubber slant Autolink, a 9 that I had gotten from Berganzi in like a trade. I still have it. It's a great mouthpiece. And I put it on my what they call a transitional. So it was a 252. I don't remember the last 3 digits. I sold it to Chris Kuzmi. You better still have that horn, man. Chris Kuzmi bought the but it was a transitional 252,000 with the B and the B flat keys on opposite sides of the bell, and a rubber link. And he picked up a didn't have the articulated G sharp or any of that. And it was just, it sounded exactly like him on a Mark VI with the Gardala. Wow. So, I mean, okay, it's the painter, not the brush. There is no gear that is going to make you sound exactly like Michael Brecker. I would love to take everybody's money, but it's not going to happen. I can't make you sound like him. The sound was him. The sound was it was an amalgamation, a continuation of everything that he heard, everything he practiced, everything that he had digested. And the big thing with the equipment was that Dave, you could probably elaborate on this more, but he had herniated his throat. And there's, if you look through various pictures of him way back, he had like a black, like a support around his throat. He had had a surgery. He had confided in me that he wished he hadn't had the surgery. He says the surgery was a mistake. I shouldn't have had it done. So it's my understanding that, like, even going back, like Live at the Lighthouse, 1972, both Liebman and Grossman were playing those old 1940s, like Ben Webster, Lucky Thompson style 4-star master link, which is also Charles Lloyd played one, you know, on what is the original Forest Flower with Cecil McBee and Jack DeJohnette and Keith. So they were playing those small tip opening hard reed and a really large chamber, and that's how they were getting that sound. But then the electric music, he was playing so hard that he herniated his throat. Dave, do you want to jump in for a sec? Because you were, I was a kid when that happened.
And that is that Mike was playing on one of those 4-star master links early on.
Correct. They all were.
Yeah. When you see the photos of like close-ups of him with Dreams, that was around 1970. He's playing one of those links. And Adam describes it correctly. He apparently, as he described it to me, he like herniated something. And these days, if they did that surgery to fix it, they would go down the throat and do it with microsurgery. But back then they had to go in here and they cut some nerves. So when he blew, you know, his neck did a Dizzy Gillespie cheek thing, which you can only imagine how much that hurt. And actually, I remember, see this poster right here? This is a poster from Mike's first concert as a leader quartet, which was in Maine. When the album, Mike called me and said, do you have a venue in Augusta, Maine? Because I need to work this band out and I don't want to get a New York Times review yet. And I said, well, in Augusta, Maine, I can guarantee you a rabid crowd and for sure no New York Times. So he did. And at that point, he was saying, I'm working on this Iwi thing because I'm afraid I'm not going to be playing saxophone much more. Like, I don't know what to do. It hurts so bad that I'm afraid that all I'm going to be able to do is play the Iwi, because he could dial that back. He could change the resistance, so it was real easy to play. And obviously he worked it out. So
if you go back to like the Dreams record, like Crunchy Granola, or the Mel Lewis and Friends with Freddie, he's playing on an Autolink, and that's like a great sound, but he had hurt his throat. And then the next transition from that, he says, was the Dukoff. But the early Dukoffs weren't. It wasn't silverite. It was a brass. Well, some of them were solid silver, and some of them were a brass with like a nickel plating. He had them. I got to see the piece. I mean, he had like most of his collection around. So for the last recording, he hadn't played in 2 years, and he was going to go in and make the record that we all know and have studied. And he said, I haven't played a gig in 2 years. And typically live, I need the mouthpiece to blow and to respond a certain way because I need to hear myself live. He says, I'm going to be in the studio, I'm going to have headphones on, and I'm going to be in front of a microphone. So I want the sound to be exactly the way I want it, and not to be like I'm compromising because of the needs professionally of the circumstances of the gig. So we went all the way around. We worked on old Autolinks. We worked on, I had these bronze castings of a 1940s, some people call it a stubby, like a stubby Dukoff. So I made him 2 of those. I made Super Tone Master Autolinks. He had hard rubber Berg Larsens. He had a silver Francois Louis and a wooden Francois Louis. I mean, he had everything. And he basically just brought everything to my house and was like, here's everything, look through this stuff, and what do you think's going to work? And we went all the way around the block. We went all the way around the world, back to the thing that he was most comfortable with was a Gardala. And then we started taking the baffle down kind of like peeling the layers of an onion. I didn't want to go too far because, like a haircut, once you cut it off, I can't put it back, you know? So in 8 different sessions, we kind of like peeled like a layer of the onion away from the baffle and like lowered it like gradually, kind of like I mean the onion is a good analogy, but also like on the fader on a board, I was like going like one click at a time to basically tone it down a little bit. And in 8 sessions, we got the baffle down. And there's a picture that Dave has of his mouthpiece in the Brecker
I'm looking at
archives.
it. I'm trying to
And
find it. It's
and
on
yeah,
the website.
it's on the
Yeah,
website. Ben, can you
yeah,
grab it?
Susan, oh, let me work on it, but just to,
Okay.
you know, the horn, the 86,000 Mark 6 that Mike played basically his whole career, that's under his son's bed. It's not going
Oh,
anywhere at present.
yeah,
And
that's where it should stay.
Susan, we were talking about it, and I said, wow, people ask about that all the time. And she brings it in and says, why don't you take it for 2 weeks? So we did a photo shoot with the horn, like we were going to sell a horn on eBay. Like, here's the right hand key stack, here's the left hand key stack, here's the left thumb, here's the thumb rest and the bell and the neck and all that. And all those photos are on the website, so you can see it. But also in the case is the same mouthpiece that you're talking about. So
And
keep
that's
talking and I'll see if I can find it. But it's
that's
right.
basically the mouthpiece, you know. I mean, it doesn't really look like, if you look at pictures of other Gardalas, they're a lot higher and they have like a shelf in it with the cross X shape hatch marks. And if you look at the one that he had, we kind of, it wasn't like a auto link like super low, but it wasn't like super high either. It was like the Goldilocks, you know. He kept on saying, yeah, this is like Goldilocks. It's not too soft, it's not too hard, it's just right. So what's the magic combination? 10,000 hours of practicing? Yeah, there you go. See how the baffle is lowered? Wait, no, that's
That's not quite it.
No,
that's
that's
not the
another,
one.
we have a,
That's it.
we have a
The
Dukoff here,
tarnished
but that's
green
not
one.
it.
Okay, sorry. Now I got to move the participants.
No,
so
it's
I
okay.
no, yeah, there you
So
go.
I mean, what's that? There you go. That's
That's
it.
it. That's the one.
That's the photo. So it took 9 separate sessions to get that exactly the way he wanted it. But I don't know. I'm proud of the way that record, the Pilgrimage record. He sounds beautiful on it, and that's what he wanted, you know. And again, like he said, he's like, I'm not going to be in front of an audience struggling to hear myself over the drums or the amplifiers. I'm going to be sitting in a booth with isolation and in front of a microphone. So I really want the sound to be the way I want it to sound. And you know,
Adam, did you do the rubber link that he used on the Ballads record?
no. That's an original link. He got it from Dino Gavoni, who's a wonderful saxophonist in his own right and a professor at Berkeley. You know, anybody in Boston and Rhode Island knows Dino Gavoni. He's a total, you know, he's really good.
It's funny. I
So
got a
that
kick
was,
out of it on the photo art on the Ballads album. He gives a photo to the link.
yeah, that's a
One of the
hard rubber
photos is
auto link
just
that
a
was,
rubber link, which is,
yeah. It's my understanding that after Mike passed, the mouthpiece was returned to Dino, but the mouthpiece that he played on the Ballads record and also with James Taylor, it's a hard rubber slant. It was Dino Gavoni's. It was on loan, and Dino has the piece back, and I didn't touch it. I didn't do anything to it. It was, if something's not broken, I don't need to work on it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Adam's great at that, by the way. He's the mouthpiece whisperer, you know.
That's a good one.
We'll all pause for a short period of silence here. I broke my reso chamber, dropped, whole tip shattered. So in the meantime, I've got these 2 later kind of 80s, 90s vintage links that are from Doc Tenney. And one of them, rubber links, one of them played really good, and Adam made it into a complete sports car that, like, all my reads got better immediately after he saw it. And the other one I had just gotten, it was kind of like the mouthpiece equivalent of a stray cat. It was kind of like it didn't work. It was all messed up. And Adam got to it and it plays great now. So yeah, he's kind of brilliant at that. My own personal testimony.
It took 20 years of hard work. I didn't just like start out being good at it. I had to work really hard at it, but it makes me happy to make other people happy, you know? So Thanks. Let's not have it all be about mouthpieces though, because as I said, Brecker sounded great on everything. Even a con
and the funny-
saxophone with a rubber link, he still sounded like he did on strap hanging. It was
Yeah.
he transcended the gear.
5 of Mike's mouthpieces right over here. And when I play them, I don't sound anything like Mike. I don't understand. I sound so much like Dave Demsey. It's inescapable. Yeah.
Well, guys, I think we're gonna wrap it up here. Thank you for being here, everyone. It's been fantastic to hear all you guys, talking about what's in the books, the practice method. I think that'll help a lot of people as they're going into either using stuff from Michael Brecker's notebooks or even just kind of copying that practice method, and then all the other insights we've all gotten. So I really appreciate it. I think we're going to end our live stream now, and if anyone wants to share some closing thoughts.
Well,
you can.
Chuck and Larry, thanks. Because it's not only
Yes.
this book out, you kind of changed the course of jazz learning history here. Let's hope
You
that
really did. It's a landmark endeavor.
Oh,
Thanks for it's a labor of love.
Thank you for making the book,
It was our
guys.
pleasure. I can tell you that we had a ball. We worked hard, especially Larry. Larry is Larry's one of the world's great jazz resources, if you ask me, and I'm so fortunate to work with him. So
Yeah.
Thank you, both of you guys.
This wouldn't be possible without you, David. Just making sure, keeping the family happy and being so respectful with everything. Thanks so much.
Well, Susan continues to be such a peach of a person, and Randy is hugely involved constantly in this too. So yeah, I mean, it's who knew that it would end up this way, but it's just a total joy to work with them on this.
And one more thing, if I could, which is that I've been corresponding with Rick, and I'm pretty sure we're going to be publishing a book of his before the end of the year, 365 days of practice. Just a wonderful document.
Wow.
Rick Slicks.
Thanks for the plug. I'm looking forward to working on it together with you guys. And there will be a section at the beginning of the book that goes into more detail about this whole practice method. So for those of you who are interested in that,
Great.
It's great.
it'll be there.
And thank you, Ben. We really appreciate your getting
Yeah.
us all together here.
Absolutely. Thanks for organizing it, reaching out to
Thanks
all
for
of us.
everyone for coming and talking about Michael Brecker. Holy cow. Yeah,
Awesome.
now I just want to go get on my horn. That's all I want to do right
Yeah.
now.
And
All right,
Mike,
we're gonna-
meanwhile, is somewhere completely mystified as to why any of us would care about what he did.
He probably has some perspective now, right? Now he's like, maybe he sees himself, in context, I hope. All right, cool. Signing off here, and thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks
Each
so
cut.
much.
All right, so good. There.